Yo, so guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to how war in Ukraine is destroying Russia. I've not seen much about the situation recently. I saw, I think, earlier today that I think the Russian troops were being taken out of, or that they surrendered a part of Ukraine that they were in before, maybe a city or a town. I don't actually know. I might be talking out my ass. Knowing me, I probably am, but it's real life law, and sorry about that. Oh my fucking throat. Um, fuck me. Do I restart this intro? I can't be asked. What was I saying? Real life law. Yeah, I mean, I react to this channel quite a lot, and I enjoy it. The sort of content is, I feel like it's quite. I mean, it's obviously quite recent, and it's like up to date news. But I wouldn't call this a news channel. He's just does sort of information based things. But I guess this is kind of news for me. I mean, I don't watch the news, so this is my sort of news source, I guess you could say. So I mean, yeah, we're just going to jump into this. I don't know why I'm talking about this random stuff. Hopefully you're going to enjoy. Links are in the description to my Patreon if you want to see some more videos of mine or you want to suggest me some videos to watch. But let's jump into this and see about this whole situation. I mean, the whole world is in the mud at this point. China, England, I think just the cost of living everywhere is up. I don't know how the US is doing. I'm pretty sure it's probably the same. Probably not as bad, but still, I mean, gas prices will be up, which probably means everything else is going up in price too. And yeah, obviously Russia are now facing struggles here. Ukraine's going through the shit. But yeah, we're gonna jump into this, and yeah, I'm just gonna jump into the video now. I'm talking too much.
Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine more than
Look at what he's done there, man. I mean, I wonder what this was before. Was it just a similar building to this? God
eight
damn.
months ago is leading not only to the destruction of Ukraine, but to the destruction of Russia itself. Tens of thousands of people on both sides have already lost their lives over this conflict. And that's in addition to the more than 7.5 million Ukrainians who have left their country as refugees, and the more than 1 million Russians who have left theirs as
Wow, a lot of Russians have left as well.
exiles. On September 21st, Putin announced the first wartime mobilization of men in Russia since the Second World War, a call for at least 300,000 additional men to be drafted and sent to the front line in Ukraine to fight and potentially to die. Within hours of that
Fucking hell.
announcement, the prices for flights going anywhere outside of Russia skyrocketed to never-before-seen rates, as hundreds of thousands of Russian men.
I wonder if they allowed them to leave. I mean, he's probably going to talk about it, but knowing Russia, it's not a dictatorship as such, I don't think, but it kind of is. I mean, is it? Actually, no, it is. I mean, he gets elected, but I remember looking at a video about Putin, and like he got elected and he was gone for a little bit, then he came back. And I mean, in terms of like allowing people to leave and that, we're gonna see. But I wonder if there was some delays of flights or flights were suddenly cancelled out of nowhere.
Suddenly became desperate to leave their country and escape. But they had and continue to have very limited options for escape. For months beforehand, nearly every country in Europe and North America had blocked off their airspaces to all Russian flights, and nearly every
Wow.
European-based carrier had shut down their flights to Russia as well. By the time of Putin's mobilization announcement, there were only 2 European-based carriers remaining operating flights to Russia: Air Serbia out of Belgrade and Turkish Airlines out of Istanbul. For any Russians fleeing the country by commercial air to Europe, these were the only 2 choices to pick from, and so their prices temporarily exploded to more than 9,000
Oh my days, for one person, 9,000. Oh
euros
mate.
for a one-way economy fare ticket out of Moscow, which is more than half the median annual salary for everyday Russians. Most everyday Russians simply couldn't afford that high of a price to fly to Europe to escape. But it started becoming increasingly difficult to escape by land as well. By the end of September, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and even Finland had each taken the unprecedented step to completely lock their land borders down with Russia, denying anyone with Russian citizenship entry for any reason, even if they held valid visas. That
Shit.
meant that travel by land to Europe was also mostly impossible for Russians fleeing the country, unless, of course, they wanted to book it through the active war zone in Ukraine. The only possible land route to Europe for escaping Russians still remaining as of the production of this video is through the very narrow sliver of Norway in the far northwest of the country. Norway has still not shut down their small border here with Russia yet.
But imagine getting to this border. That's like a flipping death wish at the end of the day. Because I mean, at this time of year, I mean, I don't think it really matters in this sort of area of the world. No matter what time of the year, it's going to be full of snow and freezing and cold. And I mean, is there roads? Is there civilizations here?
And the E-105 highway that leads to it beyond
There
Mermaids
is.
continues to remain open for now. But for most Russians fleeing the consequences of this war, the route to Norway is thousands of kilometers away from them and difficult and expensive to get to.
It's a huge
At the
country.
same time, an estimated 70% of Russian citizens don't even possess a passport that's required for international travel like this. And that means that for most Russians wanting to flee the country, their only really good options are to the south in the former Soviet countries of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, and Armenia, where they can all still enter without visas and some even without passports. As members of the Eurasian Economic Union, basically Russia's version of the European Union, Russians entering into Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia retain the right to live and work within them, making them the easiest and the cheapest countries for Russians to escape into. As a result, satellite imagery taken on September the 25th shows a huge traffic jam of desperate Russian vehicles attempting to cross the border into Georgia, potentially as long as 30 kilometers or 19 miles. In a similar fashion, queues of Russians in
19-mile long queue. I mean, it's understandable. That is insane.
cars attempting to enter Kazakhstan can be seen in video clips stretching for nearly as far as the eye can see. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have already made it down to these four countries, and more coming down all the time. But they're not the only places that Russians are escaping to. In one particularly desperate and bold case,
No
two
way.
Russian men evading the draft acquired a boat in the remote far eastern town of Ekvekanot and sailed it nearly 500 kilometers across the Bering Sea to the American town of Gamble.
I mean, you got to think, right? People in this side of Russia, because Russia's so big, it touches all parts of the world. They're gonna have no association to the want and need of taking over Ukraine or like fighting war in Ukraine. I mean, most of the people won't anyway because it just they don't want to fucking lose their lives over something that I think is pointless in the grand scheme of things. So, I mean, the fact that even people on this side of Russia are, I mean, obviously they're going to be drafted because it's the same country, but it's I'm assuming it's a completely different world, like different ethnicities, people with different backgrounds, with different religions, different beliefs and stuff. And even they're being drafted. I can only imagine the further east you go in Russia, the less likely people will be to want to get involved. But overall, even just in the whole of Russia, I mean, you're seeing people escape and stuff, trying to leave. I'm surprised that they're being allowed to, because I see Russia as a country that would be like, nah, you've got to stay here and fight. Do it for the flag, you know, that kind of sort of mentality.
On Alaska's St. Lawrence Island, where they immediately requested asylum and were flown over to Anchorage by US officials for processing. Many more who couldn't escape
fair
or
enough.
leave for whatever reason began searching on Google how to break their own arms or limbs just in order to avoid the draft. The day after Putin's mobilization announcement, the term "how to break an arm at home" became the top search trend on Google within Russia. In total, within merely a month of Putin's announcement of partial military mobilization in Russia, more than 700,000 people, most of them young military-age men, have fled the country to somewhere else abroad. More than double the amount of men that Putin announced he was planning on having drafted. This is
It's sad, man, because like, it's just an average man like me. I would be probably on the top of the list for people having forced to be in, like, getting involved into this kind of stuff because I'm at the sort of age and all that kind of stuff. And I just can't imagine. I genuinely can't imagine how it would be. Like, obviously, it was how it was like during the world wars, etc. And we know the stuff that done like mentally to people, to the, like, people who were just sort of put into it because they had to. And it's the same situation here. And there will obviously be so many men that will have just gone into it because they had no other way of getting out, or just they had no other options. So it's just actually, like, when you actually think about it, it's horrible, honestly. And is it just men or is it females as well? Because I'm hearing just men, but I'm assuming there was some females that were drafted as well, no? In terms of like the mobilization, etc. If not, that is insanity. And I'm not saying they should make females go, but it just makes you think, God damn, being a man can be hard in certain situations. We have a lot of advantages for sure, but this has got to be the worst possible situation any human can be put into.
also in addition to the more than 500,000 Russians who had already left the country before the mobilization was even announced. People of all different kinds, from YouTubers, journalists, and political refugees, fearful of 15-year jail sentences for opposing the war online. to
Wow.
millionaires fearful of losing their assets in the West, to tech workers fearful of losing their Western jobs, alongside many others. That means that at least 1.2 million Russians have left the country since the invasion of Ukraine began, representing the largest exodus of Russians from the country in history since the
Holy
1917
shit.
October Revolution and the Bolshevik rise to power. And that isn't even to say anything of the unknown numbers of Russian men getting killed and maimed for life in Ukraine, which, according to US estimates, is already at least 70 to 80,000 killed and wounded, with Ukrainian losses in life probably being very similar, already making
Oh
it the
man.
deadliest war seen in Europe in generations since 1945. And all of this loss of people either to warfare or to migration is only exacerbating what was already arguably Russia's and Ukraine's biggest problem before the war. Their populations were each already in a terminal decline for decades, and this war is only making that problem a lot worse. It could get so bad that within 20 years from now, we may not even recognize either Russia or Ukraine as countries in the same way we see them today, and they may no longer even exist as we know them. Let me explain a little bit what I mean. This on the left is the population pyramid of Russia, while this on the right is the population pyramid of Ukraine.
So this means I remember doing this in geography. So this is the youngest and this is the oldest. So the populations are quite old because I remember learning, right? He's probably going to talk about it, but I want to use my knowledge from what I remember. Um, it wants to be. I think the best way is to be like a Christmas tree, sort of going up like that. Like the wider, the lower, the better. The lower, the wider at the bottom, the better, and it sort of goes up slowly. But this obviously shows the generations have gone older. Like 30 years ago is when it would have been like a Christmas tree kind of shape, you know. But yeah, this is interesting to see. I wonder how like countries like England look with this.
These graphs are essentially a snapshot of both countries' populations that reveal the numbers of people of all ages and genders, and they both appear very similar, which is a bad thing. At the top of each, you can see these gaps in people in their 70s, the World War II generation that suffered tens of millions of people dead in both countries. To be born a boy anywhere in the Soviet Union in 1923 was perhaps the
Shit, there's a lot more females, isn't there? Because of the war. Wait, that's crazy because of the world wars and stuff.
single worst time anywhere in the Soviet Union in 1923 was perhaps the single worst time, place, and gender to have been born across most of human history.
Wow.
3.4 million boys were born in the Soviet Union that year. And by the time these 3.4 million boys would be 23 years old at the end of 1946, more than 2/3 of them would already be dead. To have been
Mental.
born male in the Soviet Union in 1923, you had less than a 1 in 3 chance of surviving beyond your 23rd birthday. The loss in
Holy
life
shit.
of so many young people like this throughout the 1930s and 40s meant that a lot of young people at that time in both Ukraine and Russia were never able to have any children. And that meant the kids they never had simply didn't exist around 20 years later when they would normally also be having their own kids, causing a population hit or echo of the lost World War II generation around here in the mid to late 1960s that reduced
That is actually crazy. You can literally tell the history from these sorts of graphs. Mad. So there's just a lot more females in Russia in general then. I mean, obviously now the more it's less at this point, but like it's more sort of I guess from like here it's pretty even, but
their population equivalent of Gen Xers. These echoes of the lost World War II generation continue to ripple across both Russian and Ukrainian society about every 20 to 25 years. But the two most recent ripples hitting the Zoomers, and whatever generation is being born now will be called, have come almost precisely at times of other great national crises, which only exacerbated their problems for both countries' populations. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed just as the second echo of the lost World War II generation was starting. With the collapse in Soviet-era state services and structures came a rocketing in the rates of alcoholism, opioid use, suicides, crime, and HIV/AIDS that plagued the populations of both Ukraine and Russia alike for years afterwards, and caused each of their life expectancies, especially for men, to plummet. Throughout the mid-1990s and early 2000s, the life expectancy for Russian and Ukrainian men alike were 17 years fewer than men over in Western Europe, and 13 years fewer than their female counterparts. They were nearly on a par with men in Afghanistan and many sub-Saharan African nations despite being at peace. And at the same time, rates of migration abroad following the collapse of the Iron Curtain and communism exploded, as millions of Ukrainians and Russians sought out better opportunities for themselves and their families abroad over in the West. And simultaneously, as the death and migration rates were skyrocketing in the 90s, the numbers of births to replace them were plummeting, a situation which continues to this day. Ukrainian women, even before the invasion, were only having an average of 1.16 children each, the second lowest rate of births anywhere in the world, just behind South Korea, and well beneath the natural population replacement level of 2.1 births per woman. And unlike many Western countries that make up for their own low levels of births with high levels of immigration, Ukraine has had a net negative rate of migration for decades, with many times more people leaving every year than entering. So naturally, as a result of all these factors, the population of Ukraine has literally decreased every single year since 1993, down from a peak of nearly 52 million people right at the end of the Cold War to just over 41 million immediately before the invasion, when also factoring in the 2.5 million people in Crimea who were lost to the Russians in 2014. Overall, this represents a crash of nearly 20% of the Ukrainian population in only 30 years. And Russia's situation isn't that much better. Plagued with largely the same societal and medical issues as Ukraine following the Soviet collapse, in the 30 years now since 1992, Russia has only ever seen 3 years of population growth between 2013 and 2015, while every single other year has been nothing but continuous decline. With a current birth rate of 1.5 children per woman overall, and a slightly positive immigration rate of people mostly coming from Central Asia, the Russians have been losing people at a slower rate than Ukraine, but they've still been losing people. And the official numbers of births across Russia are also fairly deceiving, because Russia is a multi-ethnic country, and the ethnic Russians themselves are having far fewer children than their ethnic minorities are. This is a map of all the oblasts, republics, and provinces of Russia colored and numbered by birth rate seen a decade ago in 2012. And this is a map of all of Russia's various ethnic groups. And, as you can see, the regions of higher birth rates almost identically overlap with the regions of Russia's various ethnic minorities, like in Buryatia, Sakha, Tuva, Dagestan, Chechnya, the North Caucasus, and Tatarstan. Many of these ethnically distinct regions of Russia already enjoy a large degree of autonomy from the central government in Moscow, and almost operate like quasi-independent countries. And some of them, like Chechnya and Dagestan, have previously fought bloody wars of independence from Russia in very recent history that failed.
I mean, the people from these regions are built different, man. I mean, I might be stereotyping a little bit, but from what I've seen, these people from these regions are built different to any humans on this planet. In a positive way, like they just seem to be built with steel, man. There's a reason why Dagestan produces so many insanely good wrestlers, because they're just fighting their whole lives in terms of, I guess, actual fighting, but in other ways as well. Like they're just absolute warriors. So, and Chechnya as well. I mean, it's the same sort of situation. I think Chechnya might be a bit worse. I'm not actually too sure, or it was at a certain point, but. Yeah, I don't know if these countries would want to be independent. Oh, sorry, these places would want to be like independent like countries or anything. But I know there's a lot of hostilities between them and Russia.
Previously fought bloody wars of independence from Russia in very recent history that failed, but may not fail again, as the population of Russians continues to decline, while the populations of these groups continues to increase. They may demand more autonomy from Moscow or even independence once again. And if one of them ever becomes successful in the future, like Chechnya, it could trigger a cascading effect of more and more of the other internal republics declaring their independence as well, and lead to a dissolution or even collapse across the Russian Federation. And while that might seem unlikely right now, remember that Russia has been a multi-ethnic empire for centuries, and has already collapsed twice in the previous century, in 1917 and again in 1991. There is no guarantee with its population crisis and badly going war in Ukraine that it won't or can't happen sometime again this century. But even with the seizure of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 that theoretically added 2.5 million people into Russia, Russia's overall population today is still lower than it was before the collapse of the Soviet Union by nearly 1 million people.
Oh
which
wow.
wasn't helped out at all by the years of the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020 and 2021 alone, due to excess COVID-19 deaths and a still very low birth and migration rate, the Russian population lost 1.7 million people. The largest loss of people ever in Russia during peacetime, and the largest loss in general since the Second World War. And now, in 2022, with the unleashing of the biggest war seen in Russia and Ukraine since the Second World War, this population problem for both of them that has been going on for the past 30 years now is only going to get way, way worse than it even already was. For Ukraine, at least 7.6 million people have evacuated the country and become refugees since the invasion began, meaning that nearly 1 in 5 Ukrainians before the invasion have left the country in less than 8 months. That is a similar loss in population that Ukraine experienced over 30 years between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Russian invasion itself, and implies that there's only around 33.5 million Ukrainians remaining within the country right now. Nearly 20 million less than there were immediately after the Soviet collapse.
Look what's happened, man. Oh my days.
And of course, that is to say nothing of the unknown numbers of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike who have lost their lives or become catastrophically injured since the invasion began, which is almost certainly a very high number stretching into the tens to hundreds of thousands. Ukraine will never be the same again after this war is over, even if they do push all the way ahead to ultimate victory. And while the raw numbers of Russia's exiles leaving the country are nowhere near as large or catastrophic as Ukraine's refugees, they're still pretty bad for Russia's internal demographics. Remember that the vast majority of the 1.2 million Russians who have already left so far are either highly educated or young, and especially are young men.
Yep, and they're going to be benefiting other countries and stuff, whilst Russia will be losing out because they're trying to do this stuff, or Putin is trying to do all this craziness, which is obviously no one wants to do this. This is a different world, man. I mean, again, people wouldn't have wanted to do this back in during the World Wars, World War One, World War Two, but nowadays it's a completely different world, man. Like, people aren't going to do it. So many people, so many more people will resist it, and there were people that would have helped Russia in the future. Again, they might be smart, they might be this or that, just certain ways they would have benefited the country loads. And now they're going to go and benefit other countries because they're going to be away from Russia.
Before the invasion, Russia had about 33 million young men between the ages of 16 and 49, who could theoretically be capable of military service. Conservatively estimating that around 800,000 of those men have since left the country, and at least 70,000 others have become killed or wounded in Ukraine so far, that is nearly 3% of Russia's total supply of men younger than 49 who will no longer contribute to the economy or the military so far. As the war in Ukraine continues to drag on and casualties continue to mount up, Putin will be forced into calling in more draftees and conscripts to replace the losses. And that means that more and more draft-age men are going to be leaving the country to escape it. In order to stop them from leaving, Russia will eventually be left with little other choice than to shut down their borders completely like during the Soviet era, and dramatically increase repression and surveillance at home, which will lead to people becoming even more desperate to leave and escape as Russia descends more and more into the authoritarianism and even totalitarianism of the past. Russia has already lost more people this year than it has in any other year since World War II, breaking its own record for that was only set last year in 2021. How many more will it and Ukraine lose by the time the war is over? And will either of them, with historically low birth and migration rates, ever be able to actually recover? I don't know the answer to either of those questions, but it does appear that Putin is using the invasion of Ukraine to try and expand Russia's population and solve some of his own country's problem. Within days of ordering the mobilization on September the 30th, Russia unilaterally announced their annexations of 4 Ukrainian oblasts: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, collectively representing about 15% of Ukraine's total territory, and the largest annexation or conquest of land seen in Europe since the Second World War. Only one other country in the world has so far recognized these Russian annexations as legitimate: North Korea, which I guess is unsurprising. And despite declaring them as...
To be fair, I'm surprised China hasn't done that. I thought they're
Russian
boys.
territory, the Russians themselves only occupy parts of each, with the Ukrainian military still in control of large sections of each, including the capital of the Zaporizhia Oblast. But by declaring these territories as integral parts of Russia, Putin has given himself the legal ability to deploy freshly drafted conscripts to them to fight. Under Russian law, conscripts cannot legally be sent to fight in wars abroad and may only be used to defend the territorial integrity of Russia itself. So, now that Russia has declared these oblasts as parts of Russia, the hundreds of thousands of men being drafted can now
Oh my
legally be sent
days.
there to fight against the Ukrainians. And
Fucking hell, they're just sending them out to die. It's actually insane, man. This guy, he's just doing this for his ego at this point. He's just doing this to try and make himself be seen as winning, you know, not taking the loss or whatever. Bro, this is insanity. How about you get on the front lines and do it yourself? And do the world a favor? Like, come on now.
moreover, annexing them is stealing about 9 million civilians away from Ukraine and forcibly adding them into Russia, which, in Putin's mind, may be sufficient numbers to replace the people that his country is losing to casualties and exiles. But that's of course assuming that Ukraine, being increasingly well supplied with arms from the West, won't simply just recapture them and take all those people back, which continues to remain a possible, if not even plausible, scenario. Of course, there's other reasons and explanations behind
I
Putin's
just want to
decision.
see, because I did hear Ukraine took over a city back, or took a city back. Ukraine city. Let's search that. It's been going for 9 months. Oh my days. So Kherson. So they lost the Battle of Kiev, the Battle of Kharkiv, and the Battle of Kherson. Is Kherson? Yeah. Okay. So this has sort of changed in the last 10 days since this video was posted. Oh mate, it's crazy out here. It's crazy out here, man. But that's I guess a good thing to hear from this.
To invade Ukraine and escalate the conflict further, from Ukraine's recently discovered oil and gas reserves to Russia's own desire to expand their territory towards more geographically defensible frontiers. But regardless of Putin's justifications, the war in Ukraine is among the darkest chapters of 21st century history so far, and it is partially a consequence of Russia's own internal demographic crisis that has been going on for decades now. But unfortunately, if I produced videos covering the war itself on YouTube, with the full details of what's actually happening on the ground and why it's all happening, the disturbing, violent, and controversial details of discussing a catastrophic ongoing war would cause the videos to become demonetized and age restricted, which is something I completely understand and frankly agree with. I don't believe ads should be shown alongside suffering and tragedy, but it does ultimately mean that YouTube's algorithm wouldn't promote these videos to you because of their age restriction, and that means that you simply wouldn't ever see them here. And that's why instead, I created yet another full-length companion video to this one in my ongoing Modern Conflict series that I uploaded directly to Nebula titled Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, Phase 2. This episode covers what appears to be the second phase of the Russian invasion, taking place immediately after my first episode on this conflict that I released last month, that covers the invasion's first phase and why the Russian army failed in its initial blitzkrieg and goal of capturing the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. This second episode I've produced for the ongoing Ukraine war covers how the Russian and Ukrainian armies entered into a long, grinding stalemate for months, and then how the Ukrainians managed to defy all the odds and push back against the Russians, reclaiming thousands of square kilometers worth of their occupied territory in days, and seizing the momentum that led Putin to announce his country's military mobilization just last month. As you've probably heard by now, Nebula is home to tons of exclusive ad-free.
Is this the end of the video? Yeah, I mean, it was a very good video, you know. I learned quite a lot from what I've not really seen, and yeah, man, it's insanity. Ireland has taken about 170 years for its population to recover to the same level it was prior to the potato famine, so extreme population losses can be felt for a long time. And I learned about that as well. It's wild how you can see the rippling effects of World War Two through the demographics. Yeah, I know that baffled me, man. But yeah, this is crazy. And I mean, from people watching, I don't know, people who are from Russia or Ukraine, they're both suffering, man. I mean, obviously Ukraine is going through absolute shit, but even from Russia's perspective, or the people of Russia who are being forced into war when they have no interest in it and they're still being forced into it, it's just something I can't imagine, you know. So yeah, I'm sending love to people again if you are watching from Russia or anything, but it's crazy, man. I just pray that I'll never be put in situations like this, man. I really do because I don't know what the hell I would do. But yeah, that's this reaction. Until next time.